And we are now going to move on to session 4, which again is shifting the perspective slightly, moving from the view of a funder towards the view of an organisation that acts very much as a boundary spanner between forms of research and policy making. And we're going to go to session 4, where Katie Thorpe is going to talk to us about navigating the science policy nexus from the Institute for Government. So Katie, please feel free to take the floor, and it's good to see you, and thanks for coming along today.
My pleasure. Thank you very much, Matt. I don't know, am I somewhere on the screen where you can see me at this point?
You are?
Yes, okay, getting nods. Fantastic. Thank you very much. A little bit of context, personal context. My children are both at home. One has COVID, one sort of has a cold. So I've been in and out a little bit, learning how to bake erasers this morning, but I have been following along as far as I can, and it's great to be with you here today. What I'm going to do is say a little bit about who I am, who the Institute for Government is. I know we've been mentioned a couple of times already this morning. Explain why we're here and what we're talking about, and then I want to give you just a few, nothing that you won't have heard of, simple models for what kind of policy research interface looks like. They're fairly light-hearted. And then, having spoken to Matt about what you might like to hear, I'm going to focus on what we've learnt from doing a lot of courses with academics who want to be engaged with policymakers. Some of the things that we've learnt from them, what we can tell you they say about it, and what we've learned about what works and what you can do as policy engagement people within universities to encourage what we think is the right sort of helpful activity. Please do chuck in. I see a lot of people feeling my pain. Thank you very much. Please do. I'm assuming somebody's going to coordinate questions and things as we go through, but yeah, put them in the chat. And I'm very happy to answer questions. If I'm pitching it a little bit wrong for you, then tell me that as well, and I'll change focus. First thing I'm going to do is, so as a professional facilitator, one would hope I can get this right around presenting in Teams. Doesn't seem to be doing very much for me at the moment. Am I enabled to present?
Yes, you should be.
Okay, let me try a different way. It didn't seem to want me to do it that way. Let's do it this way. Okay, are we seeing that? Perfect. Okay, so Matt gave me the title Navigating the Science Policy Nexus, and I said I don't really want to talk just about science, and also I wouldn't like to tell you exactly what I think a nexus is. So we've changed it a little bit to navigating the interface between research and policy. And I've called it the Good News Edition because I want to focus on good news for you. First thing I want to do, though, is go back up to the top of my presentation. There we go. So a little bit about the Institute, then I'll tell you a little bit about my role and a bit about the work that we do. So the Institute for Government is an independent and non-partisan think tank. So we are interested in how government does policy. We are interested in, of course, what they do, but we don't try and tell them what they should do. We just try and tell them how they should go about the process effectively. Our origin story is that our founder, David Sainsbury, who is a member of the Sainsbury's supermarket family, he worked for many years kind of running Sainsbury's, and then he got a job in government as a Minister for Business in Tony Blair's government. And he asked himself, why is it that government doesn't seem to work as well as Sainsbury's? And he got very interested in that question, how Whitehall is organised, how policy making works, how ministers work with civil servants and accountabilities and so on. And he thought, luckily, I'm a billionaire and a philanthropist, so I'm able to create my own think tank to look into those exact questions. So that is where we came from. So we are very fortunate that we have funding from his foundation, which means that we are very independent in the way that we go about our business. There are about 50 of us. We are based there in that very lovely building. It has slightly dodgy plumbing, so it's not quite as good as it looks, but it's very nice, and it's based there in central London near Whitehall and Westminster, which was always seen as very important that we could be part of that landscape. If you're interested in our funding, We have 5-star transparency rating, and you can go and check that out. A little bit about our work. So we work on ministers themselves, how they can be effective. We have a whole archive of material called Ministers Reflect, which is sort of exit interviews with ministers after they've left office, asking them what they know now that they wish they'd known then, and their reflections on civil servants and how the whole process works. All searchable, a treasure trove of information for anybody working in politics. We do work on the size and shape of the civil service, and our flagship report, Whitehall Monitor, is stuffed full of more charts than you can possibly imagine. So if you like charts and graphs about government, have a look at that. We do work on Parliament as well, and we do work on the effectiveness of public services, something that government itself finds very hard to judge. So a lot of that report is saying there's not enough data. We do work on policy making, and obviously that's where a lot of our interest in use of evidence comes in. And we do work on how it's all going to be paid for. And there are a few little projects you probably heard of, like Brexit, devolution, and so on, that we also do some specific work on. So that's a bit about what we do. And specifically our work on what I'm calling now the research policy interface. We have written 2 very imaginatively entitled reports, one called How Academia Can Work with Government, and one called How Government Can Work with Academia. And they were from 2019. We've recently kind of done an update just on the government part, just to check whether it's still in line with what we originally thought, and it more or less is. A few things have moved a little bit, but I think those messages are all still current. And we've also written a guide called How to Engage with Policymakers, specifically aimed at academics and the arts and humanities. And that came out of a very long collaboration we've had with the AHRC, training a group of 20 or so arts and humanities academics every year to think about how they're going to engage with policymakers. I know we've got at least one alumnus on the call. Arlene is a friend, very much a friend of that course. And so we do a lot of work with universities. I work with research councils. We're also, as James said, doing some work with the ESRC now to help get their central team more up to speed on how policymaking works in real life. And yeah, I should think I've probably trained several hundred academics over the last few years exactly in this area. So that's where a lot of my insights are coming from as we go through this. Any questions before I go on about the Institute for Government and what we do?
So I'm with you, Katie. I'll just, if any questions come in, I will bring people in. I can't see any hands up. Is there anything in the text box, Joseph, for Katie?
No, nothing yet.
They feel my pain, which is fine, thank you. They're obviously, the boys have just got their iPad now, my iPad. So moving on. I thought I would just give you a few little models of policymaking for you to have a look at. These will not be a surprise to you. You are all people that know about this stuff, but I think it helps sometimes to have a little bit of framing. So how does policymaking really work? This is how civil servants are told policymaking is supposed to work. This is in the Treasury Green Book, which is their little manual on how to do policymaking. And it says that you start off with a clear rationale. We need to change this policy for these very good reasons. You draft up some clear objectives. At this point, obviously, you would be assembling all the best evidence. You would work out which option works the best through a process of rational appraisal. It would be implemented. There would be good monitoring of that. It would be evaluated. Now you know this is definitely not realistic. It would be fully evaluated. Feedback would come back and the whole process would go around again. There are some bits of policy that work in that way. They are not in the majority. So if we look at the other end of the spectrum, this is what we like to call the cynical policy model. This is very much based on the experience of civil servants who we've had working at the IFG, and you might see a passing resemblance to how things work on the thick of it. If you've seen that, I'm just going to let you read it. Start at the top left. It doesn't always work like this, but I have checked with people and they've said it does work like this sometimes and it can be even worse than this. And that is from people who've worked in the opposition as well as people who are actually working in government. And obviously when academics get the sense that this is how government works, it is deeply disheartening. because you think, how can we ever get evidence in if they're making it on the back of a fag packet on the way into on the way to make an announcement? So we did some research on this. This is a number of years old now, but we did some research. We really wanted to understand how policy making really worked in practice, and this is what we came up with. There we go. Something that looks completely impossible and incomprehensible to get. It's a super complicated process. I know you can't read that. That's okay. It's impressionistic. But the point is that there are lots and lots of ways in. And this is where the good news starts. There are lots of ways into policy. They're not always the obvious ones. And what I'd like to do in the rest of the session is just say, here are some things that you could be doing. If I was in charge of a university, what would I do right now to try and start improving policy engagement? So that's the perspective I'm coming from. So good news. I've got 3 pieces of what I consider to be good news for you. Number 1 is that in spite of those upsetting diagrams, policymakers do want good evidence. The issue is that when they want it, they often want it urgently. They want it right now. It's hard to interest very busy, particularly civil servants, who, as we know, have their own unique challenges in engaging with the UK civil service, which I can expound at length if you want me to. I don't suppose you do. But they often, when they want it right now, which means that's when they get Google out. That's when they go to their list of people they already know. That's when they start Googling, you know, research, education, resilience, or whatever it might be, and seeing what comes up. So my first piece of advice is make sure that people can find you and your researchers easily. And I spend a lot of time scooting around on staff pages on university websites. I think they've improved a lot based on what I've seen, but I think there is still some room for improvement. So in a minute, I'll just talk about some of those things. I might ask you what you think as well. And the other thing is just to be really on top of who is asking for input. What are the current issues happening right now? What are select committees looking at? What are the inquiries? Who's doing consultations? What are departments currently interested in? And if you're on top of that, you are at least in a position to contribute when the question gets asked. So a little bit on making researchers easy to find. I'm going to ask you, first of all, what do you think is good practice? Anybody like to say what they think is good practice? If you were a policymaker, what would you find helpful if you were just kind of Googling to find a researcher? Any thoughts?
Giles, go for it.
Appearing on the first page of the Google response to your key terms.
Yes, absolutely. So you want them to come up first. There are some things that can be done around that, but yes, luckily the academic pages do normally come up high. Arlene, thank you. I know you are a very big Twitter fan, so you might want to see that you've come across them by them being active on Twitter. Specialisms, absolutely. Comprehensible job titles, email address, expertise. Oh, so true, Sarah. Comprehensible summaries of research interest. Yes, all of those things. I have got some do's here, many of which you agree with. So having clear contact details, linking to other work or other profiles, listing areas of expertise. That isn't always done, but if I'm coming on a website, I don't want to see lots of I don't really mind where you've got your, you know, where you've got your undergrad. I obtained your 2-1 in whatever from wherever. That's not really what interests me. I want to know what you can talk about that I need to know about. So really good to list areas of expertise. Include media and policy engagement activities. And keep it up to date. These are all things that sound relatively simple, but they're not all done well. So if you have any influence over this, trying to be a bit more policy focused in the way those profiles go up so that when somebody Googles, they find what they need to find. Somebody put photos on there. I think photos are really helpful if you put them up. There may be reasons not to, and I understand that. But I think photos are quite helpful just in creating a human connection, which is what you're trying to do when you're madly trying to find a response, a bit of evidence to help you answer a question the minister has chucked at you. I have here an example. I hope my friends from Leeds won't mind that I've picked out one of theirs as an example of a really good profile. This is from someone I know. I don't think he'll mind. So you can see there that, yeah, Lucy, that's a good question about photos, and that's why I'm not sure. I think it's an open question, but I'm interested to know what other people think. Making research, so here we go, you can see areas of expertise right up there, really clear contact details and a nice clear explanation of what he does. And I think this is a really good example of how to do a good profile page. You will have your own thoughts, but I think this is a thing that works well. This was one I think we're okay to punch up. I think we're punching up here if I bring up the Cambridge one. Anybody missing? Here are your quick links: staff, students, alumni, business. What if I'm a policymaker? What if I want to use your research? There's nothing there that's obvious. And this is echoed a lot across. So just be thinking, if somebody is coming here from outside wanting to know what your research is so they can use it to make better policy, how will they know what to do? So that is a question. Any thoughts on that? Do keep them coming. Oh, that's a good question. Does appearing on the conversation? I think so. What we know is that policymakers use the conversation. We do know that they look at it. I don't think it would say, oh, they've been on the conversation, therefore they'll be great at talking to us. But I do think it will raise the profile of the research. And I think it is a place that policymakers look, definitely. So I think the conversation is a helpful place to be putting articles. Also, obviously, they provide some editorial help as well. Generally, people I've spoken to have said they found that a positive experience working with the conversation. Okay, so you're making your researchers easy to find. Yes, Beverly, I'm sure that's right. So one of the things is going to be around, hi everybody, is this all up to date? I don't know, I'll leave that up to you to figure out how you help people keep things up to date. But there's nothing more off-putting than seeing here's an event that's coming up that actually took place 6 months ago, for example. So the other thing is just to be really on top of who is currently asking for input. I know you know all about following select committees and inquiries. It's good to keep an eye on relevant departments as well. They sometimes launch consultations, things that people can contribute to. Generally, it's best for someone just to say, here's what I think, I'm an expert, rather than spending a long time crafting something which feels very academic. It's much, don't caveat those things as much as you might think. I'm an expert, here's what I think, is kind of fine for those things. Policy reviews, so similarly, if there's been a review set up to look at a specific issue, people can contribute to those. Also advisory committees, so something like the Migration Advisory Committee or SAGE, of course, they are run by academics generally. They often seek other academic input. And areas of research interest, I'm sure you will know about those, but just in case anybody doesn't, every civil service department has been asked to come up with a list of things that they would like to know more about. So evidence and expertise that they are specifically looking for. You just Google areas of research interest, UK government, and it will come up. And they are now fairly chunky documents. They got 2 or 3 pages of here's the stuff we're looking for, and they provide somebody with a really good I'm doing some research on this, I know that you're interested in it, but they also help you to keep abreast of what's going on and what's important and priorities for government at any moment. Obviously following all the relevant Twitter accounts and newsletters and so on, so you can push people and say, hey, there's a consultation up here, don't think it'll take you very long, could you just spend an hour or so filling out this, so that we've put a marker down. I'm just going to have a quick look at some of these questions before I move on. Oh, good. You've got some problem solving going on. How would we advise tips for ECRs and PhD students who may not have access or experience to in all of these spaces yet? I am going to come on to training in a moment, but I have got some ideas about how I would frame it, which I will come on to, and then I'm happy to discuss that in more detail a little bit later. Producing ARIs in Parliament to show help scope. Oh, that's great. Very useful. I did not know that. Thank you. I've learned something. Oh, thank you, Arlene. Yes, there's a link to our guide, which does set out all the main routes to engagement, hints and tips, and has some case studies with some of our course alumni. Okay, that was good news 1, that policymakers do actually want to hear from experts. They just need to know where they are. So that's good news number 1. Good news number 2, policy engagement doesn't actually have to be painful. From the perspective of a very busy academic researcher who perhaps has not really thought very much about policy engagement before, And they're told they've got to do it, and they've got to have impact, and they've got to kind of fill all this in on their grant forms. I don't know for sure, but this is how I imagine what it kind of looks like. It's a little bit like that, I think. What is happening in the middle there? And it feels, and I know this because I've spoken to lots of people about this, it feels like there's just a kind of big blob of probably angry, very busy policymakers. And it's very hard to differentiate who they are and who they might be and how you find a way in. And the best way of helping people is often just to demystify that a little bit. So to increase overall levels of impact through an institution, supporting academics with training, I know that isn't easy when you don't have loads of budget, but I do think it's really important. I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. And this is if I have one key point for this whole thing, it is try and encourage and incentivize easier, lower intensity activity, which is more about finding people who are interested in what you're interested in and talking to them. And that's not everything will have a result, but you need to try and reward the scattering of the seeds, not just the growing of the beautiful sunflower. So we'll talk a bit more about those, and you can perhaps give me your ideas for how to do that. But supporting academics with training, first of all, there is, my experience, as I said, is that people do not generally come with a good understanding of how government works. That's partly because the UK education system does not teach them that very well. It's also sometimes because they've come from other countries, of course, and they don't have experience with it. So a simple government 101, this is government, this is parliament, this is our nightmare landscape of arm's length bodies, this is devolved government, this is local government, that is very useful basic information to give people. And you can do that easily enough. There are resources out there. In fact, you could use our guide for arts and humanities researchers, which is not simply limited to them. So you can do that. And then, of course, there are skills around how to write good policy briefings, but there's resources out there. Post does some really good hints and tips on how to write good policy briefings. It's freely available. So there is a lot of freely available stuff out there, which I do think it's really important to support people with, because public engagement tends to be more embedded in universities' training offer, my experience suggests, than policy engagement. But you can do a little that will go a long way, I think, with that. I'm sure my partnerships team is listening to this, and they would be very remiss not to point out that the Institute for Government does run training courses as well. We run virtually, and we will come to you if you like to do that. So we've done a lot of work before, and generally the feedback we get is extremely, it is very much along the lines of, I didn't know this before, this has been so helpful, I simply wasn't aware of all this stuff. So there's a real just awareness thing there for most academics. It feels too difficult, I don't really understand it, demystify it for people. And the other thing is just this, around there we go, I've got a picture of some flowers. And I know that Matt feels very strongly about this as well. It's the relationship building piece, but it doesn't have to be, oh, I need to try and find a way to talk to the Secretary of State for immigration. It doesn't need to be that. It can be, who else do I know who's interested in this topic? Who else wants to solve it? How do I contact them? There might be lots of ways. There might be, you could go to conferences. You can speak to that person in your department who knows everybody or who you met once and who might put you in touch with them. You can simply, we've talked about Twitter, you can go on Twitter. Particularly policymakers don't say very much on Twitter very often. Civil servants are lurkers, famously, rather than people that actually put out their opinions, but they're there. But people who do are people from work centres, people from charities, people from maybe civil society, grassroots organisations. Marcus Rashford, always a good person to engage with, if you're talking about food poverty, or Jack Monroe. So there are people out there who are interested in what you're interested in. And there are ways to contact them. If you can't contact them direct, draw out your map and figure out where you can find a way to contact them. And then simply stay in touch. Stay in touch with the people you already like. That's always the advice I give on networking. Don't try and find people you didn't get on with. The ones that you liked and had a spark with, stay in touch, find out what they're doing, ask them to help you. That's another really good way of getting people on board, weirdly enough. Could you be on my advisory board? I'm doing some stuff on this. I'd really value some kind of practical tips for how this looks in practice when this policy is implemented. So building networks and rewarding that, finding a way to incentivize that sort of external focused activity versus finding a few impact case studies and funding them to the max is, I think, a better way to grow impact across a whole institution. I'm just going to have a quick look at your questions and comments. Fantastic. There's some great resources going in. Yeah, the Open Innovation Team is worth mentioning. So they are people who are dedicated to bringing academic expertise into government as demand, according to the demand that is led by government departments. So they run conferences and they set up networks, and they want to try and do that. They're definitely worth following and getting in touch with. So good question about I'm going to come on to local in a moment. I'm going to come on to local stuff in a moment, but then we can come back to that because I think increasingly local stuff is important. Matt, do you want to add anything? Because I know that this is something that you feel very strongly about as well.
No, I think everything you've said I would agree with. Just maybe touch on the no surprises rule. The relationships in a political context need to be trust-based. Could you say anything on that?
Yeah, so I think if you get into the happy position of actually being in touch with policymakers, it is important that you don't go offline and criticise them elsewhere. Is that the sort of thing that you're thinking about, Matt?
Yes, criticise them to their face, but remember that there's confidentiality. I mean, I think what's interesting is lots of academics think that ministers and civil servants only want to hear from people who will agree with them, whereas actually that's not true. What they want is to be able to have a good, robust, critical conversation, but they know that conversation is happening within a safe space for them.
Yes, yeah, that's right. And I think as well that the more you start to work with people who are interested in the same problems, the more you feel as though you're collaborating with them anyway, and you're getting your thoughts out there, and there's joint outputs and things. But certainly, yes, what policymakers can be wary of is people with very strong opinions who talk about them, especially if they're too political and you get too aligned with a particular position. So you want to try and be inside the tent, not outside the tent, I suppose. Yeah, I'm thinking about the analogy that normally goes with that. So yeah, try and make sure that challenge is provided within the context of the discussion, not critical and outside. But I say a lot of these intermediary organisations that I think you'll have commonalities with them. So, for example, what work centres, something like the Centre for Aging Better is trying to solve very particular problems about, for example, I know this because I heard from somebody last week working on this, on how to get people in their 50s and 60s working productively for longer. And suddenly this has become of interest to the government. So they are suddenly saying, hey, we need to know everything you know about this. So they are, of course, reaching out to all the people they know who know about that as well. So if you've got those relationships, you're then working with the Centre for Aging Better, who are using their networks to lead into government. And I think that's helpful to understand that that's often how it works, is that you spend a lot of time talking to people, government starts to think about it. Have you got the networks? If so, you're in. If not, you're not the people they'll go to. So I think it's really important to understand who is linked into government, who will be contacted in right now we're doing this moment, and getting them and then being part of that conversation. Okay, let me just look at this. Text. So by knowledge mobilisers, I guess you mean the kind of people who are trying to stay on top of the policy landscape and tell everybody what's going on. Is that right? Is that what you would call a policy knowledge mobiliser?
Yeah, I guess a lot of us as UPEN members probably sort of fit into this very broad remit or non-existent job title really, but in our different roles we work to support our academic communities to achieve policy impact. So I guess we're part of that ecosystem. and whether there's any sort of directing from your perspective in terms of signalling that these people exist, because I think a lot of policy stakeholders aren't aware that we sort of exist within universities and we're there to support them to engage as well as our academics to engage with them.
Yes, so certainly when I've done workshops with universities, we will point them towards the resources that exist for them within the university, which is often around communications and things like that as well. I think if you can, if as a kind of part-time knowledge mobilizer without a huge amount of time yourself, you can stay on top of all those things, then that's great, and bring things together. Of course, that's going to be efficient. That's going to be a really good way of helping people stay on top of it. I suppose what I would encourage, though, is that everybody is themselves encouraged and incentivized to have a little bit of a handle on their own policy landscape, to kind of be aware of the 2 or 3 select committees that might be important to them, to be aware of the relevant departments, arm's length bodies, intermediary organisations that have a stake in the issue, and try and keep up to date with them, because you're never going to get everything. So much of this stuff is informal that having aggregated kind of, here comes the select committee inquiry, is great, but ideally you want people to be starting to enjoy doing that for themselves. I think that's the thing, that it becomes part of the research process, is understanding what's out there in the policy landscape. And once you've made connections and you've sort of seen for yourself how that, and people tell us it makes my research better, I get different perspectives, I get access to different sorts of resources, then you hope it becomes something that then they're not just relying on one source of information for. So I would certainly advise them to access all the resources they have, but I would also advise them just to be a bit more externally focused and a bit more aware of what's going on. Do we encourage government stakeholders to reach out to University Knowledge Mobiliser? We are certainly always banging on to government as well about how they need to talk to more people and get broader amounts of input. Unfortunately, they're too busy to listen to us as well as listening to you quite often, but absolutely. So that's in our report, how government can work better with academia. We suggest supporting more, certainly institutional memory is such a big deal, in that it's almost entirely lacking in the civil service. So where networks can be maintained by individual departments, they should be, so that it's not contingent on the one person who met somebody, leaves their role, and then you're stuck again. Does that, I don't know if that's enough or too much, but okay. Okay. Yeah, I think that's right, Lucy. That's the thing. They don't always exist, and that's something I'm very aware of. Okay, I'm going to move on to my third point, and this has obviously been touched on already. Good news 3, the future is local. And I think that this is particularly good news for institutions that are perhaps less well resourced in this area, because you will know from the levelling up agenda, there was lots and lots of things. I think there were 12 priorities, which, as we pointed out, is too many priorities to be priorities. But one of the ones that really did seem a genuinely radical proposal is more devolution, more decentralisation. And you can see there from this slide that we've got the existing devolution deals in blue and the proposed new and expanded ones. So this is obviously specifically around combined authorities and mayors, but generally speaking, I think there is going to be increasing talk and I hope resource put into things that happen at a local level. And I think it is a really good place to focus, because partnerships can be so valuable at the local level. I've got a few suggestions of things that local government is really particularly interested in generally, but then I'd also be really interested to hear what other people have done in this area, because I know a lot of universities do great work with partnering with local authorities. So one of the things is around preventative public service reform. So it's often, it is the local councils. I've got some charts and things I can show you another time that show how much local authority budgets have gone down over the last decade or so, and also how much more they're having to spend on social care. So they don't have much money. When they are hit with the bill for all the acute health and social care costs, they are the ones that are having to figure out how can we reduce this. And so they are very interested in preventative public service reform that can stop those problems occurring in the first place, because that is obviously more cost efficient. So they're very interested in anything that speaks to that agenda. Obviously around planning, creating nice communities, creating a sense of place and a sense of identity. That is something that they're very interested in. So anything to do with growth, local economic development, regeneration is also, again, an area that they are particularly interested in. Citizen participation. Now, I think this is interesting both as kind of an area of study, which is how do we do this better? So this could be things like deliberative democracy, where you get people together over a few days and kind of give them lots of information and help them come to a kind of joint conclusion about what they should do. But also participatory budgeting, which is where you get a pot of money and citizens decide how to spend it, usually a limited pot of money, but still. So these models are really interesting, and local authorities and local tiers, different tiers of local government are often interested in exploring them, but also as a method of something you could get involved with helping to organise and to run. If you could provide resource, meeting rooms, any kind of capacity to help them run those activities, that is also something they might be very interested in partnering on. As you'll be unsurprised to hear, anything at all that is related to saying give us more money is a good thing. They will be interested in anything that supports that agenda, decentralisation and devolution generally. And the other real key one is local response to the climate crisis. Hundreds of authorities have declared a local climate emergency, and a lot of the interesting work that is happening at a local level. So anything that feeds into that will be helpful to local government as well. I know we had a question on how specifically do you engage with people from local government, and many of the messages are the same. They're still busy, they still have limited resources and so on. I would say my general suggestion is that you focus even more heavily on joint outputs, things that are of immediate practical use to citizens and solve problems for citizens. I think that's the most helpful thing to do. Generally, as a starting point, going to the strategy team who can point you in the right direction of who is doing the work on this. Brilliant, look at this. Great new research centre for connecting research with local government. Brilliant. I hope somebody is collecting all these excellent resources and putting them in one place. I assume they are. That's all I had. 3 pieces of good news. Policymakers do actually want evidence. They just need to be able to find it. Number 2, it's easier than you think, and you can incentivise that kind of externally focused activity rather than only ever focusing on the big bit of policy that changed as a direct result of your research, the Holy Grail. And things are happening locally which are very interesting and great for universities to get involved with, and easier for those with fewer resources.
Thank you very much, Katie. That was great. As all the questions and points in the chat show, that's really stimulated some thinking. We've got 5 minutes before we break to lunch. So please, can I invite anybody that wants to ask a question or raise an issue, put your hand up and we'll get as many as we can in before lunch. And I'll jump straight to Sarah, please.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks very much, Katie. That was really brilliant. I just wanted to pick up on your last point about it perhaps being easier to engage, for universities to engage with local government. Do you think the same is true in reverse? In that anecdotally, I would suggest that there are perhaps less capabilities and less established structures within local government to engage with universities.
Yes, I think that is probably true, but they are so strapped for resource that if you can offer anything in the way of resource, they're more likely to jump on it. And the one thing I didn't say that local government really needs is evaluation. They really don't have much evaluation capacity, and I think they'll be very open to that. You're right. Yeah, where do you even go? Who is the person that does policy making? And that is why my colleague at the IFG who used to work in local government said find the policy or strategy team, start there. But it's a very fair question. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Laura, please.
Hello. So last year at a Westminster Higher Education forum conference, I think it was UKRI who said that there was like an infodemic happening at the moment, with so much research being kind of thrown at policymakers, making it difficult to actually, do anything with it. How would you, I guess, kind of mitigate this challenge? Would it be more about the sell of the research, or would it be more about the relationship being developed between the researcher and the policymaker?
I mean, I would always say the thing that makes you most likely to read an email is if you know the person that sent it to you. If I get, even if it's someone I met a couple of years ago, if I recognise the name, I think, oh yeah, nice to hear from them. So if you've got the relationships, that's definitely where I would focus, because then you're going to read that, or you'll understand, oh yeah, they were a good person. Oh yeah, they were interesting. That is the most important thing. Yeah, because policymakers are not, they're never just kind of out there saying, oh, I wonder what's happening in the world of housing. They just don't have time. So I would say certainly, yeah, focus on the relationship. However brilliant your policy briefing is, it's not going to be top of my list if I haven't seen your name. The other brilliant hint I heard last week was to say, hello, I was hoping you could give me some thoughts on this nearly finished paper that I have. Because she said, then it goes on my to-do list. It doesn't go in my to-read pile. It goes on my to-do list. So I think that is actually quite a good tip as well. But certainly I would start with relationships, personally. I don't know, what do you think, Matt?
Yeah, relationships are a key part of the research infrastructure. And what's also interesting is coming out from the conversation is that relationships themselves take time and resources and investment. And if you haven't got them, you can't magic them up quickly. So it is part about that building the foundations within the broader ecosystem. Now, I've got a final question which I'll ask, but if anybody else wants to put their hand up and ask something, please do while we've got a few minutes. I'm interested to know from your perspective, Katie, we've discussed a lot and will continue to do so, the importance of equality, diversity and inclusion. And I'm just wondering from your perspective, what are the equality dimensions that we need to think about? Because in many ways, many of the academics and many of the professional knowledge support staff are not working on a level playing field.
Yes, that's right. So one thing to say is that the more formal the route of engagement, the more seriously they will be taking EDI, I think, generally. So select committees and people doing and kind of formal consultations, they will have an eye on who is contributing. Can we make sure we're hearing from enough women, enough? I don't know how broad they extend which characteristics they're looking for. I imagine ethnicity and so on, and also affected populations and so on. So I think they do take that agenda seriously, and I think that you can capitalise on that. I'd certainly at the IFG we never have all male panels, for example. We just won't do it. We try and make it diverse where we can, and I think that's increasingly happening. I think there is, and that's certainly something I would suggest if universities aren't doing that already, is making sure that when speaker opportunities come up, you're thinking, actually, could this go to this underrepresented group versus my normal go-to guy? Because otherwise you just don't find out, who's doing it well. Obviously, there is a danger. I think the majority of input still comes from your average person would be a white man from the southeast. And I think it is important to provide mentoring as well to show that these things are possible. And just wherever you can, be promoting and supporting and suggesting to people this might be a good thing for you to do. But there is a lot to overcome.
Okay, let's have a quick couple of concluding comments. Then we're going to go to Kaylee first and then Dave Bell. Kaylee?
Oh, just very quickly, I guess this is where I think that particular challenge which Laura raised in the chat about the relationships aspect, I think that's where the knowledge broker network, which is very nascent, it doesn't exist across all universities. We have different capacities to support policy engagement. So about 5% of the capacity, some are 100%. But in theory, being able to tap into those networks, they can help open up these opportunities to engage and understand their own communities, so that opportunities aren't just landing with the same person. We're moving beyond that bilateral relationship where it's very difficult to find out what opportunities are available. So trying to channel opportunities through networks like UPEN to enable that more open and inclusive aspect of engagement, which then doesn't just rely on you knowing the academic already beforehand, or having already seen their profile before. So I was just reflecting on that comment, and I guess previous comment as well. Thank you.
Dave?
Hi, yes. It's Katie, and actually to all the speakers, this has been a really fascinating day. And I'm really happy it keeps coming back to the EDI question, which I'll be chairing the session I've been working with Kaylee and Olivia on. And I think it's something that sits at the heart of our questions at the Scottish Policy and Research Exchange as well. And I feel like this is an opportunity to go into more depth and think more critically from other perspectives about what this looks like, because there's a huge amount of work from normally marginalized perspectives, whether it's feminist or decolonial or disability, where we can start really trying to critique what do we mean by inclusivity, who's being asked to be included in what, and what are they trying to lean into culture that is, they've been asked to lean into culture that is actually marginalizing them in the first place, whose knowledge counts, and what are the kind of hierarchies of evidence. That's often a question that not many people want to really touch. But in the work I've done before, I've certainly felt that very strongly, that we've got very good rhetoric on these things, but what does it really take to put these critical perspectives in practice? And I think that's something that is about navigating uncertainty and really centering issues of what is good. How do we know what that means, and who decides? So I guess these are just slightly more comments than questions, but I've seen a lot of talks like this where we have like really good practical advice, but that sits very differently for different people.
That's a great point, Dave. The thing there is whose knowledge counts, and what you're pushing us on is the existence of a rhetoric reality gap. How do we actually make some of this changes in reality to open up a broader range of perspectives? Thank you, Katie. I'm going to draw this to a close. Katie, you've clearly done a great job, because you've propelled us into a much broader conversation that will follow on later. The Institute for Government, again, has been brilliant to UPEN and a great partner and friend to us as an organisation. Katie, thank you for giving us your time this morning. And we will hopefully continue to work closely with you in the future. So thank you.
Thank you very
much.
Now
Reached 12:45, just gone. So that brings us to the end of session 4.